Hi there, with the new Kindle Paperwhite coming out very soon, one of the few remaining differences between the Paperwhite and the Kindle Oasis are these page turn buttons. And I have to say, when I first bought my Kindle Oasis over a year ago, I really thought these page turn buttons would be a must-have feature, but as it turns out, I don't actually use them as much as I thought I would be. In today's video, we're doing a deep dive into these page turn buttons to see if they're worth that $250 premium price tag of the Kindle Oasis, and we'll also be looking at the competition of all the other e-readers out there that also have page turn buttons and see how the Kindle Oasis stacks up to that. And then lastly, I'll be sharing my personal thoughts on if Kindle page turn buttons are absolutely worth it or not. Now, the first thing I actually want to do is compare the Oasis to the other competition out there when it comes to page turn buttons. And the first device to do that is the Kobo Forma. Now, this device will actually be replaced very soon as well with the Kobo Sage, but for right now, this is what I have, the Kobo Forma. And the page turn buttons on here are actually a little bit different than the Kindle Oasis. Firstly, these buttons are much more plasticky. They're definitely more solid than the Kindle Oasis. The Kindle Oasis is much more rounded. The Kobo Forma has a much more square shape to it. There's also a very big gap in the middle between the two buttons, and my finger kind of rests right in the middle, hovering more over the bottom button. And the one disadvantage of this design is it's kind of difficult to press the upper page turn button when you want to press that. You have to reach for it because the device is so big and that gap between the two buttons is actually pretty large. I really do enjoy the Kobo Forma when I use this device, but that gap between the page turn buttons is kind of annoying, especially when you want to quickly go through a book or skim through a few pages. Going back and forth between the two buttons can be a bit difficult. Now, after the Kobo Forma, we also have the Kobo Libra. Now, I have the H2O model over here, but the Libra 2 is also coming out very soon. Those page turn buttons look much nicer, but the same design principles are still there. The Libra H2O also has a gap in between the buttons. I do think the Libra 2 will have a less of a gap like the Kindle Oasis, so I'm interested to see how that is like. But the Libra 2 buttons are still very small compared to the Kobo Forma. The Kobo Forma has these ginormous buttons, and the Libra buttons are much more smaller, more similar to the Kindle Oasis, much more comparable. In all honesty, I do like the H2O buttons as long as they work. I have a lot of problems with this device specifically. I really hope they fix those problems with the Libra 2. Sometimes when I press the button, it doesn't actually work, but if they do fix that problem, the button design itself is actually pretty good. Pressing them isn't too bad. The gap in between is much better. I just wish they would work every single time I press them. I don't have that problem on my Forma. I don't have that problem on my Kindle Oasis. This is a very specific problem to the H2O. Now, moving on from the Kobo series over here, let's talk about the Nook Glow Light. This device is definitely the most different when it comes to page turn buttons, mainly because there are 4 page turn buttons, 2 on each side. Now, I personally do not like this design. I think it clutters up the bezels a bit too much, but there are people out there who really appreciate being able to go back and forth depending which hand you're holding it in. Additionally, this is also very different from the Kobo and the Kindle because there's no gap in between these buttons. They're actually right up against each other, which makes pressing the top one and the bottom one very seamless. You can just slide your thumb up and down, and you can kind of feel the division between the two, but I definitely see myself mixing up these buttons if I'm just quickly going back and forth. You don't really have that tactile indicator telling you which button you're pressing. Now, the biggest issue with the Nook though is the software is not the best. I really can't recommend the Nook to anyone because it's such a slow device and it just doesn't work well compared to the Kobo or the Kindle. But purely speaking about the buttons, this has the most buttons, and if that's important to you, the Nook is definitely where you want to be. Now that we've examined the Kobo buttons as well as the Nook buttons, let me move back over to the Kindle Oasis and talk about this. These are still my favorite page turn buttons. They're just more clicky in my opinion. I've never had an issue pressing them. The gap in between the buttons is the perfect amount. You can quickly go back and forth between the buttons. I can actually put my thumb on the bottom button and still press the top button, and they're both very clicky. I also really enjoy the shape of these buttons. It's kind of a rounded shape and it doesn't feel too plasticky either. They just work super well and they're very, very reliable. It's really hard to say. The buttons just feel so much more better on the Kindle Oasis than any other device that I've used personally. This may just be a subjective thing for me, but after using each one of these devices, I can personally say I really enjoy the buttons the most on the Kindle Oasis. Now that we've actually talked about the buttons, let's actually move on from that and talk about the other ways you can turn the page, because having buttons isn't the most important thing on the device. What's important is reading books, and when you're reading a book, you don't really have to have these page turn buttons. You can actually just press on the right side of the screen for any of these devices and the page turn will happen that way. You could also just swipe back and forth on the screen and the page turn will happen that way. That's why the Kindle Paperwhite doesn't have any buttons at all. All you do is swipe and tap, and that's how you turn the page. So these are all premium features you're getting on all these devices. These page turn buttons aren't necessary, they're just nice to have. Now when I first got my Kindle Oasis, I really thought I would be using those buttons quite often, but it turns out I really wasn't. If you're a first-time Kindle buyer, my recommendation to you is don't buy these devices strictly for the page turn buttons. It's really one of those things you won't even realize you don't have if you never experienced it before. And if you actually look at the Kindle Voyage, which is the older premium model of the Kindle lineup before the Oasis was a thing, this device also does not have page turn buttons. It has these haptics on the left and right side that you tap on. These page turn buttons are actually relatively new to the Kindle world, and I don't think they're really necessary at all. So to give you my recap on my personal thoughts of what I think about page turn buttons, here it is. I don't think they're really necessary. Are they nice to have? Sure. Are they probably very cheap to make and add to the device? Also sure. But I don't think they're really necessary. When it comes to the new Kindle Paperwhite, they really did focus on all the right things. Page turn buttons are not a requirement for an e-reader device. I'm really happy they focus on other things like that warm light display. Something like that is so much more important than some silly page turn buttons. Now with that being said though, if you are somebody who relies on page turn buttons, whether it's for accessibility reasons or anything like that, I personally feel the Kindle Oasis has the best page turn buttons you're gonna find on the market right now. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you have page turn buttons on your e-reader? I'm really curious to hear if you think they're worth the high price tag. I don't know why these turned into such a premium feature, but they are. Also, if you enjoyed this video, check out my review of the Kindle Oasis where I talk more about those page turn buttons and also show you all the other premium features that the Kindle Oasis has to offer. Link for that video on the screen right now. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.